Well, hello and welcome all to our session today. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. Let me know in the chat if there's any issues with either the sound or the visual. Good, we'll take that as a positive. Great, Remy, thank you very much. That's good. Fantastic, Vicky, thank you. Feel free to use the chat as we go through, and I will do my best if anyone has any questions as they come up. But welcome to our session on the essential behaviours for talent intelligence professionals. I should point out that this isn't going to be an exhaustive list, but over the course of the next 30 minutes, I hope to outline a few of the most critical competencies for potential and existing talent in our industry. We'll spend some time unpicking some of those competencies and behaviours by considering some examples where it has, or in most cases, hasn't been put into practice. We'll try to understand how their impact can be felt when we consider our standard tasks in TI. And while there are many valuable behaviours we could consider, there is one that acts as the foundation for all the others. So to help us uncover our first behaviour, I want you to turn back in time with me to a very cold, crisp Tuesday morning, not unlike the morning here in Belfast, on the 28th of January 1986. The sun had been up for less than an hour, and temperatures were just 2 degrees centigrade above freezing whenever the crew of STS 51L boarded. And a whole nation excitedly waited, huddled around their televisions while they joined in the countdown to launch. But just a mere 73 seconds after launch, unfortunately, the worst happened. And hopefully you'll be able to see my screen there. Just those 73 seconds after launch, the Space Shuttle Challenger disintegrated in a very distinctive Y-shaped explosion, which sadly killed all 7 crew members on board. And for the first time in its entire history, NASA had lost a crew on a mission. So what led up to that disaster, and why on earth, you're probably asking yourself, am I talking to you about it in connection with essential behaviours for talent intelligence professionals? Well, to answer that question, let's take a few steps back to just before the Challenger launch, because up to that day, the launch of Challenger had been delayed 5 times due to sub-freezing temperatures at Cape Canaveral. The engineers and the specialists from the firm that had designed the rocket and the containment systems that steadfastly refused to give the green light for launch until temperatures were at a safer, warmer level. And on that morning, temperatures were still much colder than any of the previous NASA launches. And those same engineers had refused again to provide the needed approval for launch. Finally, under considerable pressure from the administration at the time, combined with the threat of the loss of a $1 billion contract, the engineers acquiesced and they gave the go-ahead. Now, in the months that followed, I'll just stop sharing that. In the months that followed, a commission went through every single piece of data to identify the root cause. And what they discovered wasn't an unpredictable or unforeseen issue that caused the catastrophe. Instead, it was a series of flaws, a series of behaviours, most notably a distinct lack of humility on the part of NASA's administration. Now, the extensive data confirmed that there had been a leak in the booster tank. And the source, well, it was a very tiny donut-shaped rubber part called an O-ring. I'm sure many of you are familiar with O-rings. They're a pretty common part of everyday life. I've one here, which hopefully you can see against the background. So it's a small rubber ring. I've got that from some plastic piping. Now, you'll have come across them maybe in the plumbing in your house, in your boiler, maybe your shower head. If you've children, you might recognize smaller ones from the medicine dosing syringes that come with liquid medicine. But the O-ring from Challenger is a little bit bigger than this, about 12 feet or just over 3.5 meters in diameter. So relatively tiny in the big rocket size scheme of things. But because it was made of rubber, it had some weaknesses. Can you guess what one of those was? It was temperature. Remember the temperature that early January day? It was just 2 degrees centigrade or 36 degrees Fahrenheit, if you take your temperature in that measurement. Anyone in the chat want to take a guess at the minimum operating temperature for the O-ring? If the temperature outside was 2 degrees centigrade or 36 degrees Fahrenheit. Any quick guesses in chat on what that temperature, safe operating temperature would be? Safe operating temperature was 12 degrees centigrade or 53 degrees Fahrenheit. So quite some margin between the ambient temperature outside and the safe operating temperature. Now, in a now infamous test, Dr. Richard Feynman demonstrated what this meant at a press conference 5 months after the explosion. He twisted a small O-ring in a vice and then he dipped it into a glass of ice water. Now, don't worry, as much as I love a good science experiment and a Blue Peter, here's one I made earlier, I'm not going to replicate it here. I'm not going to take that chance with a glass of water near my laptop. But when Dr. Feynman pulled it from the glass, it had kept its twisted shape, really showing its lack of resilience to the cold. And in Challenger's case, yeah, just as Remy said there in the chat, the O-ring got so cold, it actually shrunk and it allowed the fuel to leak into that booster tank. So why on earth did they launch? And what can we learn from it? Well, of course, as important as our work is, it's fair to say that what we do will rarely, if ever, be life or death. But there are clear takeaways about the behaviours that are essential for our profession. Sadly for NASA, they ignored what the data was telling them. They were so confident in their expertise and their achievements that nothing or no one from outside of their immediate culture or sphere of specialist knowledge was fit to judge or critique their work. Their conformity to their organizational culture meant that any dissenting views or data that disconfirmed what they thought was correct was ignored. They only took on board the data that confirmed and underscored what they were already thinking, and they took shortcuts to get to that end result quicker. They were so confident because of their successful track record. And remember, up to this point, they had had many successful launches, that confidence spilt over into arrogance with devastating effects. Now, most of us are in our profession because we love to solve problems. We love to uncover the data that gives our colleagues and clients the answers that they need. We work really hard to learn an awful lot of information. We fall down rabbit holes investigating Java developers and end up reading about coffee bean farmers in Indonesia. True story. Naturally, we might rightly gain confidence in our skills and abilities, and that's absolutely fair. And it may seem like there should be a point where we don't need to learn anything about a particular topic or a skill set or a location because we've researched it so many times in the past. However, as the pandemic and the current complex market and economics have recently shown, talent landscapes can change too fast to allow complacency. As soon as you think you've got it figured out, you're kind of already out of date. And that leads us to our first essential behaviour, humility. Now, unfortunately, humility is not often valued or promoted in today's culture of self-branding. And humility in business is often associated with weakness and a lack of self-confidence. But actually, that couldn't be further from the truth. A recent Forbes article described it as the most impactful quality in business and in leadership in particular. So despite its often underestimated worth, humility is by far the most important characteristic of a talent intelligence professional. Why do we say that? Well, let's think of humility against the stages that we go through on a regular basis, how that characteristic can fundamentally change how effective we are day to day. So let's take a request or a brief for a project. Having humility will mean that we won't jump to conclusions around what the stakeholder needs or wants, but instead encourage us to ask probing questions, to listen to the responses and to get the root of the problem statement, but what they need and not necessarily what they just want. Humility will also ensure that we're realistic around scope and timescales, and we'll avoid overcommitting ourselves or worse, our teams. For those of you that have been in the TI industry for some time, the fastest way, as you well know, to burn yourself out or worse, your team out, is to commit to the impossible, both in terms of the content that is included and the delivery timings. So humility will allow us to get the ask right from the outset, to manage those expectations and really set us and our teams up for success, both in the short and the long term. What about when it comes to the research itself? Well, a recent poll from our own Toby Colshaw on LinkedIn showed that many of us are facing increasing workloads with little to no investment to allow sufficient capacity to cope with these ever-growing requests. Demand is outstripping talent intelligence supply, which is a great position to be in, but also a precarious one. Because when we're faced with the potential of keeping more stakeholders happy by completing more projects than we first thought possible, we could be tempted to, like NASA, take some shortcuts. However, keeping that humble approach will help us to realise that the first piece of data we uncover is not enough to form an opinion, but it'll motivate us to cross-check and to validate across multiple sources. On the flip side, it will also help us to realise that we've got limitations and no report can contain all there is to know about a particular topic. So it'll help us to set some clear parameters and boundaries for our research to ensure that we avoid the rabbit holes, or at the very least, if we do fall down them, leave ourselves a way to get out of them. And then we come to putting those reports together, constructing those reports. Again, if you've worked in some time within TI, you may be very comfortable with visualizing your findings and outlining your conclusions and your recommendations. We can often fall into the trap of predetermining our findings before we've taken everything into account. That's only natural, but a humble approach and keeping that in check will help us to keep an open mind and allow the data to tell the story and not make the data fit a preconceived or preset story. Finally, how can an unassuming or a humble approach to presenting help us to be effective? Well, it's only natural, again, after spending huge amounts of time and energy on our projects, that it's fair to say that we can become a little or perhaps a lot protective of that work. It can be difficult not to take things personally when someone challenges our findings or our recommendations or the data that we've carefully checked and validated over many weeks. I know sometimes I still have to take a deep breath. We had an example of a client back in 2020 when we completed a large 4-month-long piece of analysis for. They asked questions in that presentation for 2.5 hours. They challenged every finding, but only scheduled 45 minutes. And they seemed at the end of it quite unimpressed. Now, credit to my team, they kept a real humble mindset. They tried to see the challenges from the client's perspective. They stayed really calm. They objectively answered all of the client's concerns. We always spent a bit of time decompressing after a big presentation, and we all agreed in this instance it was our most challenging playback to date. But interestingly, that client's feedback was superb. It was some of the best feedback we've ever had. It was actually their cultural style and the way that they work to respond to presentations in that manner. And it turned out they were very impressed. Wrong we had been. Just imagine if we had reacted defensively or negatively to what we had perceived as a pessimistic approach to our presentation. It could have been a completely different outcome. It actually led on to further work with that same client, and we continue to have a really good relationship with them today. So taking that humble approach on board, it can really help us to take into account any constructive criticism and help make our next project even better. Continuous improvement is impossible without that aspect of humility. And we should never allow our previous successful projects to impair our perception of our abilities and warp our self-confidence, unlike NASA. Success in itself should never be the driver for our confidence. It really only tells us what has worked well up until that point. Our confidence really should be based on something else. And that brings us to our next behavior characteristic. And to look at that, let me introduce you to a mathematician called Abraham Wald. Now, Wald was part of the statistical research group, which was used by the US military to help analyze data during World War II. Now, he was asked to research a really specific question. Where should the US Army, because there wasn't an Air Force at that time, where should the Army put armor on bombers to reduce casualties? It was a bit of a quandary that they had, because armor obviously protects against the bullets and incoming missiles, but it's very heavy. Too much and the planes won't perform well. Far too much, they won't fly. And too little leaves the planes too exposed. Now, the Army was planning, they had a lot of data. They were planning on adding armor strategically to the parts of the plane that tended to get the most riddled with bullets, marked by the red dots you can see there. Those are the average bullet marks on the planes that they had examined. And they asked Wald to help them determine, well, mathematically and using statistics, where's best for us out of all of these areas to enforce or reinforce the armor. But Wald actually had a completely different view. And he said the armor shouldn't go where the bullet holes are. Instead, it should go where there weren't any bullet holes at all. Because he realized that the data that the Army was looking at only included those planes that had successfully made it home. None of the analysis included data from planes that had already been shot down. So by looking at the data that was there, but also considering the data that wasn't there, Wald proposed arming the areas of planes that weren't hit, since it followed that was the reason why these planes had safely made it home in the first place, because those areas had survived intact. His recommendations were swiftly implemented, and his basic premise is still in use by the military today. What his insight identified was a misconception, which is now called survivorship bias. And it's a logic bias, which means we only look at data which has passed a certain set of criteria and often overlook data that does not. Now, Walt's exceptional attention to detail, that care that he took with his data, meant that he made efforts to look at the whole picture, to look at what the data was telling him, and to consider what it was not. So how can attention to detail, our next behavior, be a differentiator for us as talent intelligence professionals? So his name was Abraham Wald. Name just to answer your question there. So Abraham Wald. So let's take a look again at our activities in terms of talent intelligence and see how that characteristic can affect, again, our success in our day-to-day. So again, think about taking a request or a brief. How many of us have gone to great efforts to complete a project only to face utter frustration when we realize we've gotten a key basic piece of information wrong, perhaps the wrong location or a key part of the job criteria wrong, and we have to start all over again. You know, attention to detail can save us an immense amount of time and effort by helping to ensure that we get the right brief the first time. What about when it comes to the research itself? This is probably the most obvious, but it can often be the most overlooked. I remember one of my very early projects was looking for Python developers in China. Now, my initial searches returned some very, very weird results. So I started to deconstruct my search just to see what I was doing wrong. And it turns out that when I had used Google Translate, Python developer had taken a rather literal translation. So I had in fact been creating a talent intelligence report on snake charmers across China, a much more common skill set than I had actually thought. But taking a very thorough approach, it saved me a very red face with the local stakeholders with that report. And then we come again to putting those reports together. So in our very early days, we completed a 77-page location analysis for an international client. And after presenting the first draft, the client expressed some really serious concerns about the reliability of the report, which we were quite shocked by. We actually spent an additional 5 hours with that client going through each data point to reassure them of the validity of the data before they felt confident in the reliability of our recommendations. So what had created the concern? It was the combination of 3 spelling mistakes, 1 misplaced comma within a number, and an incorrectly labeled diagram, 5 kind of minor errors on the face of things, but enough to create serious doubt and undermine the weeks of excellent work that had gone into that report. So what did we learn back then? Well, the devil really is in the detail. It's not enough to just gather some facts and present the data. Spotting data anomalies or inaccuracies, spelling and grammatical errors, inconsistencies in your layout or how it's placed on the page, it's inconsistencies in your narrative, making sure one recommendation or one observation agrees with another will ensure that your project is successfully received and implemented by the stakeholder. And it will also set you up for future repeat business with that same stakeholder. They trust you once, they'll trust you again. And finally, how can being thorough and careful and having that attention to detail, that same approach to presenting helps to be effective? We've all heard the adage, fail to prepare, prepare to fail. And really, it's a cliche, but it's so true when it comes to presenting our talent intelligence reports. Preparation, and more preparation. We can't guarantee how a report's going to land, but what we can be almost 100% certain of is that there will be questions. So we've always found it useful to compile a list of maybe frequently asked questions or questions that you feel are going to come up and attach those in the appendix of your report. But what if you don't know the answer? What do you do? Well, if nerves are getting the better of you and you need some time, pause, ask a question, allow yourself time to think and don't panic. And if you genuinely don't know the answer to the question, again, this is where the humility comes in. Don't panic. Say that you don't know, but always follow up. Take their question away and give them a time scale for your response. Best way to be prepared is to see another insider in action or to get their opinion on your report beforehand. So it's this thoroughness and this robust attention to detail that will ensure repeated success. But is it enough? Just being humble and being thorough. Well, for that, let's take a look at good old Nokia, and hopefully you can see that on my screen. Now, my very first mobile phone, many moons ago, and I'll not say how many, at the grand old age of 19, was a red Nokia 5110. I wasted many an hour playing Snake on this bad boy, and rumor has it it's still holding a charge up in my attic. But almost 20 years ago, Nokia made more than half of all of the phones in the world, and it was the largest manufacturer and vendor. Now, today, they're no longer considered the best handset, and I agree, Toby, that they were the best one. I think I just like red, and as you can see, I still like red. But any guesses in the chat? They went from more than 50% of the market share in terms of handsets. Any guesses? No Googling. Any guesses on the market share today? Yeah, we're getting lots of variation there, right through from naught, I think, right up to 10. Yeah, there's a few of you that are right on the money. In fact, they're thought to only control just about 3%. I think the actual figure's 2.9% of the market share as of Q1 this year. Staggering difference between where they were then and where they are now. And there's been lots of different reports and analysis that have been done on Nokia as an institution, but they're thought to have made 3 major errors. First of all, they didn't pay attention and they underestimated what their competitors were doing. Secondly, they stuck with the same old operating system because it worked before, so it was going to work again. And it was what they'd always used. They also owned it, so there's a bit of a vested interest. Symbian, for any of you that are interested. And then finally, they rode the crest of the accidental success wave of SMS messaging, and they didn't consider that customers would want a different look of a handset, hence the touchscreens that we have today. So what can we learn from Nokia and from that example? Well, success, particularly within talent intelligence, isn't just based on our ability to simply change just for the sake of it, or to continue to do what's always worked in the past because the stakeholders have liked it, that they'll continue to like it. It's based on our ability to change faster than our competition, change faster than our own business and our stakeholders. And that brings us nicely to our third and fourth behaviours that go closely hand in hand. I think in my experience in TI, you really can't have one without the other. And that's adaptability and creativity. Because as we've mentioned before, TI is in huge demand and it's easy for us to get caught up in how busy things are. But we absolutely need to allow ourselves time to apply what we learn, to adapt to any change in circumstances and evolve to continue to meet our customers' need. So let's hold up again these qualities to our daily activities and see how they can affect us. So if we think about, again, taking a request or a brief for a project, we can't please all of the people all of the time. It's just not possible. And we do need to make sometimes some tough decisions. And we often need to adapt to the ask or to the timeframes. And sometimes that's a basic, I can't give you A, B, and C that you really want, but what I can give you is A with a little bit of X on the side, and I can give you B and C over the next 4 weeks. Just managing those expectations and adapting what we can provide. When it comes to the research itself, I'm sure you've all had the experience of thinking a piece of data is going to be very easy to come by and then discover halfway through the project that it just doesn't seem to exist despite your best efforts. For us, this often seems to crop up most whenever we're comparing similar data sets across very different locations and regions. So a little adaptation and a creative approach is needed to still produce something valuable, to still show off the data that you have been able to find without putting a glaring spotlight on what you haven't, despite those challenges. And then we come to constructing and presenting our reports. Again, it's very easy to fall into the habit of using the same layout, maybe a template or the same visuals, even the same sentence structure in your narrative when it comes to those reports, especially when you've got multiple requests. So can you reach out to someone you trust to ask their honest opinion on the work that you're producing? Do your reports feel staid and repetitive, or do they feel fresh and interesting? Could you try something new? So humility, attention to detail, adaptability, and creativity. There's so many more behaviours that we could discuss that are crucial to TI professionals. But I hope you agree that these form the bedrock, kind of a blueprint of success. And they also give us a clear idea of the disruptors within TI that we want to avoid at all costs: arrogance, carelessness, inflexibility, a lack of ingenuity. Taking those behaviours one step further, from a TI management perspective, they can present a number of challenges and opportunities. First of all, behaviours are notoriously hard to attract and recruit and assess for. We're a relatively new industry, so stipulating X number of years experience or focusing only on organisations with established TI functions can really greatly limit us. So it's important as managers that we assess based on those behaviours. But on the plus side, that means we can actually tap into the most diverse pool of applicants with a completely varied background. I'm very fortunate to work with such an incredible group of TI professionals who come from a variety of backgrounds, from doctors to musicians and so on. And it's that diversity of thought and experience that really prevents that insular culture that was prevalent in NASA in the 80s and encourages that sharing of knowledge and that expressing of dissenting opinions. It also emphasizes the importance of behavioural and skills development, not just training how to use tools or how to fill in a template. When you have a function packed full of bright, talented individuals, really keeping them motivated is no mean feat. So we need to ensure that we create that environment that encourages and allows space for personal development. not giving people space to think is a surefire way of limiting their potential. And finally, that particular mix of characteristics means our people are incredibly switched on and capable. In my experience, that their work ethic is second to none. And the danger is they can take on too much. Their willingness and ability to solve problems means that they're a natural for many side projects. So as leaders in TI, it's really our role to help our people navigate their success, help them gatekeep their precious time and personal energy, and their mental health, really, because they will return that with a tenacious appetite for high quality content and excellence. There's so many the people that we have within TI that have so much potential. And really, there's lots of different behaviours that we could have talked today, but in my experience, it's that set of behaviours that form the basis of a successful TI professional, and are really components that we should continue to invest in and nurture and develop for our future success as an industry. No doubt throughout the rest of today's session, you'll see many of these behaviours in action, from the creative art of the possible to the attention to detail in our TI collective survey results, to adapting TI to integrate it into the wider business, through to the humility needed to tell tough truths. I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking to you all today, and I'm sure there are many more behaviours that you'd include, and perhaps some maybe that you disagree with that I brought out this morning. So I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out and connect. But in the meantime, thank you for your time and enjoy the rest of the TI Jamboree. I know I will.